At one level, obviously, I'm talking this morning in this small case study, particularly about the UK and family and human rights. It will be different in your countries, and we're going to discuss that later on as we think about what we're saying. So forgive me that this is very UK focused, but I think it illustrates one or two things that probably are happening in different ways across some of your countries and in others possibly not. So as Chris said, we're going to look at family policy, things that have happened that we've been involved with over the years and now in relation to upholding the family in the life of the United Kingdom. And one or two words of introduction really that probably set the scene a bit about why for us it's so, am I all right? Why for us it's so important. Is this a divine voice that's coming in that we can, no. Anyway, why we believe that family life is so important. I mean, it trips off the tongue, doesn't it, that families, healthy marriages are the basis of a stable society. We use that terminology very often. But of course, we live today, certainly in the West, in a situation where family life is changing dramatically. There's the idea Bowman talks about sort of liquid love. So I love you today, I don't love you tomorrow, I might love you the next day. And we have family breakdown. And family breakdown is a real cause for concern. Just one or two little statistics from research that we've noticed in the United Kingdom. One staggering sort of throwaway comment is that by the time a child is 15, that child is more likely to have a smartphone than a father at home. And you can get all the figures and statistics, but that actually, by the age of 15, a child is more likely in the UK to have a smartphone than a father living at home. Staggering. And yet I can remember when I was doing a radio programme that we have in the UK called The Moral Maze, talking about the family, I was having a discussion with the head of the Single Parent Network beforehand. And she floored me completely because she said, single parenthood is not a lifetime choice. And I thought she was going to be advocating for, single parents and it works and it's fine and it's not a lifestyle choice. Cohabiting couples, the research shows, make up 19% of all couples with dependent children. And yet, if we look at the breakdown of family relationships where there are dependent children, over half of those breakdowns are from single-parent families. Now, I am not saying, and I want to stress this, I'm not saying that no single parent can be a good parent. They can. But it's not that lifestyle choice for the best environment. And in fact, 93% of parents who stay together until their child is 15, the research shows, are in fact married parents. That actually is quite staggering, isn't it? And family breakdown in the UK, and I'm sure in other parts of the world as well, and certainly across Europe, is the biggest factor in relation to child mental health and various breakdowns and problems that cause. And so we are very keen that we fight for marriage and the family as the stable breakdown. So what we're going to focus on this morning is really the relationship between the state and parental rights and what that relationship is and what it should be. And we've been focusing on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And there is a very clear statement about the importance of parents and families in the Universal Declaration. The statement that parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that should be given to their children. That's there in the Declaration. And it doesn't just cover the content of that educational programme. It's talking about the sort of holistic nature of how parents relate to their children and bring them up and teach them. And we have found recently, particularly in the UK, that there is a real blurring of those lines of what state responsibility is and what parental responsibility is. And I want to give some examples of that, particularly at the moment. And it's very, very clear, can you see all right, in relation to relationships and sex education that is being proposed in our schools. And it's something which is causing quite a bit of controversy and concern. What is that balance? Well, let's look a little bit at the background to what's happening politically at this moment in relation to that. In December 2016, the government published the Casey Review. And it was looking at how education is regulated, what actually should be taught, particularly in relation to sex and relationships education. There is this responsibility recognised between local government and the provision of education, but we are straying into slightly different territory. And this is where, as I've already indicated, there are concerns. In fact, Dame Louise Casey made a very concerning statement in the review that came out that said that she viewed religious conservatism as something that was very dangerous and akin to extremism. And you're beginning to tread in difficult waters when we look at that. So there was the Casey Review in 2016, and then a government consultation in relation to that in 2018. Now, a lot of evidence was taken, but in fact, the government then, in relation to the guidance that was to be issued, made some quite disturbing recommendations. There were good things that came out. They did affirm marriage. They did talk about healthy relationships and so on. And they did talk about the balance between state and parents. But actually, what it did, and it has now been passed in the Lords as well as House of Lords as well as the House of Commons, they talk about very much about the rights of parents no longer being the same as they were. So they're saying now that parents will not have the right to withdraw their children from lessons if they feel they are inappropriate. There will be a right of request, they're talking, so a parent can request to withdraw their child, but that is at the discretion of the head teacher. And it's only, the guidelines say, in extreme measures. Now, who defines what that is? And it's setting the precedent that actually the state knows best, and parents, they don't trust parents to provide for the best education and protection of their children. And so while there are good things like the stress on marriage and relationships, it doesn't encourage early sexual experience, but it does actually, we'll just go back slightly, no, we'll leave that there for now. It does raise some interesting and some worrying trends that are happening in the UK. And in fact, at the end of April, as I said, the House of Lords followed the voting in the House of Commons, that despite the fact that the overwhelming responses to the consultation from parents was that the guidance was straying into areas that they were concerned about, there are now 2 mandatory subjects that must be taught: relationships education and sex and relationships education. And that goes right down to primary school level, and it involves, obviously, the content of what marriage is, what relationships are. It strays into the whole area, the LGBT area, transsexualism, and so transgender issues, and so on. And the view of having age-appropriate relationships and then sex education is something that is concerning many parents, not just Christian parents, it has to be said. And in fact, it's quite interesting that there has been quite a lot of action on the ground by parents in relation to this. There has been, in Birmingham, there have been quite a lot of demonstrations and activists from Muslim parents who are saying, we're really concerned about this. We do not want our children in our primary schools being taught about these sort of relationships at this age. This is the responsibility of parents. And we will continue, as CARE, we'll continue to monitor this, to engage with it. There is the possibility that we will be looking at some sort of legal action, and also that we will be looking at whether and what we provide to help parents, particularly Christian parents, because that's our constituency, to help parents engage with their local school on those issues. Because one of the other things that happens is that the government can issue guidance and guidelines. Locally, that can be interpreted very differently. And we've seen in other areas of education where school governing bodies, which are very, very powerful, really have thought that legally they have to do certain things when they don't. And so there's quite a big education piece that needs to be done there. So the interference of the state in parental rights, you might want to discuss that. We will discuss that more a little bit later. The other area in relation to family that we've been involved with for many, many years, and my colleague Chris will smile at this, that I am now talking about marriage and tax, because I don't normally talk about tax. I just get, it doesn't float my boat particularly, so forgive me. But it is really, really important actually, because the United Kingdom is in a very different position from the rest of the OECD countries. Marriage is not prioritised in our tax system. And we have seen over many, many years that the government has moved from a position of recognising marriage to moving very much away from it. Now, of course, the government can't legislate about what a good marriage is, can't make people have good marriages. That's not the role of the government. But it sets the climate about marriage and whether it is important. It sets that fundamental framework for a good society. And if we as Christians believe that marriage is an institution ordained by God, that it's a very high calling to be respected and honoured, and mindful of all the benefits that marriage brings to society, we have argued very much over the years that marriage should be recognised and honoured, and it should be easy for people to enter marriage if that's what they are called to do. And so while it's important to understand what the state can do and can't do, nevertheless, fiscal policy provides a framework that supports the institution of marriage. Now, up until the year 2000, our government actually did recognise marriage in the tax system. But then there came a real shift away from even mentioning the word marriage. And in fact, the word marriage was removed from every official document. I think probably because of all the baggage that people have around marriage and sensitivities about that, where people had had bad experiences. But Britain became the only country in the OECD that didn't recognise marriage in its tax system. And so we have, with the aid of some very, very able consultants who worked in the Treasury and worked in other areas in relation to tax, have produced research. And it's research that actually is really, really concerning if you're looking at fiscal incentives to promote marriage. That single earner married couples with 2 children are taxed 30% 30% more than the rest of the OECD. By an international comparison, UK families pay significantly more income tax, and in fact, 85% more than the equivalent French family, for example. In 2015, we had a slight win. The coalition government actually followed up on their election promise to recognise marriage in the tax system and did allow for a partial transferable allowance for married couples and civil partners, it has to be said. But it's only set at 10%. It's sort of a token, really, and there is still much more to do. And so we've briefed, we've researched, we've produced annual research about the cost to the exchequer of not recognising marriage and promoting marriage because of the cost of family breakdown. And remember at the beginning, the evidence that shows that family breakdown occurs more if you haven't got a stable marriage relationship. In 2018, it was estimated that family breakdown costs the exchequer £51 billion. Now, they don't join the dots. Surely you would say, well, if it's costing that, at least it's got to be cost effective to try and support and promote marriage. But it's not particularly happening. And so we have done for many years this work, as I say, and will continue to do so. And it is beginning to get traction. And I just want to add one thing here that is really, really important. One of the things, and I'm sure you notice it as well if you're involved in policy work, one of the things that we find is really, really important to stress is that there aren't the quick fixes. Very often, implementing change comes after a long, long period of faithful, solid, good work with good research, and you have to be in there for the long haul. And that can be demoralising, but actually we believe that that's what we're called to do. And so I want to just move on to a couple of other areas that we have been working in that are related to family. They might on the surface not seem particularly related to family life, but are very much related to family life. And one of them has to do with the protection of children and young people online. The safety of our children within our families and our young people is hugely important. I'm sure I don't have to stress that. We all believe that. The innocence of childhood needs to be protected online. And so we aim to encourage the government to safeguard children and make a digital world where children can be treated as children. Now, of course, we know that the digital world and the technology advances that we have huge advantages. They have tremendous advantages for children's learning, just to give one example. But children are precious and childhood is precious. And as we move further into the 21st century, we must notice that childhood has radically changed. It'd be interesting whether you think it has in your countries, but certainly in Western Europe, I think it has radically changed. And our children and young people have to learn how to navigate and engage with this world. Yet far too often they are not prepared. And that is a big challenge for us. Baroness Kidron, who's a peer in our House of Lords, said this in a recent debate. We've invented a technology that assumes all users are equal. In fact, a fifth of users in the UK are children. And the digital environment that our children and young people are so immersed in doesn't recognise the simple but vital fact that they are children. So in an online world, all users are created equal. There's not a kids' version of the internet. Children are expected to live in an adult online world, and yet nowhere else in life, possibly, do we expect them to act or be treated like adults. And without looking for it, I'm sure you don't need me to say this, without looking for it, our children and young people are exposed to very graphic sexual images, violence, without looking for it, without seeking it out. It's all too easy. I had a tragic conversation just 2 or 3 weeks ago with a mother. We were at a supporter event in part of the United Kingdom, and this woman sought me out and asked for our help. Basically, her 14-year-old daughter at school had been accessing some very, very dark internet sites, as a result of which that mother walked into her daughter's bedroom and found her hanged. Now, all right, an extreme case perhaps, but we all know that there are huge issues around the images, the material that children and young people can access. Now, the protection of them and the things that you do about them, there aren't sort of quick, easy fixes, and not one fix is going to fix everything. But if we recognise that 83% of children aged 5 to 15 live in a household with access to internet through a tablet or computer, it's easy to access their mobile phones, their devices that they have. In December 2013, now think how much things have moved since 2013. In December 2013, a staggering 44,000 primary-age school children between 6 and 11 in the United Kingdom visited an adult website on a PC or a laptop. That figure rose to 200,000 for children aged 6 to 15 and to 473,000 for those 6 to 17. And in total, 1 in 20 UK visitors to an adult website each month is underage. Now, you can argue anything from statistics, but actually they are staggering, because each of those numbers represents a child or a young person who is special to God and whose life is being damaged. And so we have campaigned for many, many years and have been working with some really wonderful parliamentarians to try and make the internet a safer place for children. Some of those statistics that I mentioned are there if you need to see them. What have we been doing? Well, as I say, it's a small piece in the jigsaw possibly, but actually really, really important. So in 2017, the government actually introduced something that we had been advocating for a long time. They introduced some age verification checks through a bill called the Digital Economy Act. We championed that for quite a while, as I'd said. And in 2017, the government agreed its Digital Economy Act must require people visiting pornographic websites to prove that they are over 18. A small step. Unfortunately, in that process, the government opposed this measure. I mean, let's face it, the internet companies are very, very powerful and there's revenue in it, and et cetera, et cetera. But in fact, we worked very closely with MP Claire Perry, and an amendment actually got the government to back powers of enforcement. Now, we argued very strongly that this had to be mandatory, Because, in fact, you know, the internet companies can say, oh, yeah, we'll introduce those measures and we'll do it. You know, we'll be good boys and girls. In fact, it was shown that in many cases didn't happen. And I'm thrilled to say that actually in July, that will now be mandatory. You will have to be able to prove that you're over 18 to view these sites. And one of the interesting things in this process has been, and this is a real lesson, I think, for us who are involved in policy work, is that this is something which, yes, we're coming to because of our passionate belief in the value of our children and young people and our families because of our Christian faith. There are men and women of goodwill across all the parties in both houses who recognise the sense of this and with whom we've been able to build relationships and work together. In fact, we conducted some polling which showed that 71% of MPs were unhappy with the situation as it was. Now, it's only one bit of the jigsaw. And we are concerned about how extreme pornography is described, so what falls within those regulations. There's more we need to do, but it's a step in the process of protecting our children and our young people, which is so important. How did we go about it? The usual way that you do if you're trying to influence. Primarily building relationships with men and women of goodwill so that we have a voice. Producing really good quality, well-researched briefings. Producing research itself and speaking notes. And I have to pay tribute. I mean, I can stand here and talk about the wonderful things that care does in policy terms, and I don't want you to run away with the view that it's me doing it. Because actually, I've got to say this because he's sitting there. No, I'd say it anyway. It's actually the quality of our public policy team, which actually is a very small team, but we have found in recent years, particularly, I would say in the last 2 years particularly, the quality of the research that they produce is second to none. And the support that they give to MPs and peers, helping them as they fight these battles, which are really, really difficult at times. And I won't mention names, but I can think of one person that we work with very closely, and Chris had a meeting with just last week, I think, but who at times needs that holding hand and needs that help. And that's the relationship side that we're able to do, and it's a privilege to do as God's servants. So, protection of children online. I also want to just very quickly refer to one other area that is an area that is destroying families. And it's destroying families usually in the poorest parts of our country. If you go to certain parts of the United Kingdom, I'm sure it's true in many of your countries as well, all the way along the high street will be betting shops. The people who can least afford it. I had a gentleman sit in my office a little while ago, and he broke down in tears. And he was a gentleman who had everything, humanly speaking. He had a fantastic job in the city. He had a wonderful wife, 2 gorgeous children, this fantastic big house, wonderful flashy car. He got it all, he thought. But he became addicted to internet gambling. And one by one, those things went. He lost his job. He couldn't pay the mortgage, so he lost his house, he lost his car. His marriage broke down. He wasn't allowed contact with his children. He lost absolutely everything, and that family was destroyed. We know that particularly one of the most pernicious forms of gambling are what are called fixed odd betting terminals, where in the spin of a dice, the roll of a dice really, in a minute, you can lose £300. As people go on and on, you can lose thousands in a very, very short space of time. And so we've worked for a while with those of goodwill in our parliaments to try and regulate what happens. And so looking at the internet and internet gambling, there are a myriad of sites. And if someone really, really wanted to end their gambling addiction, they can opt out. They can get a blockage on that site, on their computer, so they can't do it. But you'd have to do it with every site. Now, if you've got a problem, the likelihood of you're getting rid of every site is very, very minimal. And so we worked, as I say, with those of goodwill to get a system where you had a one-stop shop, if you like, where there would be one site that you'd go into that would block them all. And we were thrilled that actually GamStock became fully operational at the end of 2018. And so far, and these statistics are probably, they could be updated now, but 38,000 gamblers in the UK have self-excluded from all licensed gambling sites. And that is a major achievement. And in 2018 as well, we were absolutely thrilled that the government accepted legislation and introduced legislation to reduce the maximum stake on fixed odd betting terminals from £100 to £2. We'd been working on that since 2014. And in April this year, that became mandatory. And we are so thrilled that that's happening. Why do I bring this into family? Because obviously it causes family breakdown. But actually we know that the number of child gamblers has quadrupled in just 2 years. Figures suggesting that 450,000 children aged 11 to 16 bet on a regular basis, and that 55,000 children are problem gamblers. Now, the effect on their lives as they grow up, we can only begin to imagine. And so gambling, fixed odd betting terminals, those areas, they're not just money issues, they're family issues. Of course, there's much more to do. There are games that desensitise children, so they get used to gambling, even if they're not gambling money. And there are areas that we will continue to work on because of that. Gambling advertising is a huge issue. It's probably the same across Europe, but if you look at sporting activities, if you look at football, gambling companies that sponsor the shirts of players, gambling adverts round the sites. All the major sports, if you watch them on television, gambling sites are there. And so working on advertising issues is another issue that is really, really important. And so these areas, some successes, some real successes that we thank God for. But I want to just end this bit with a quote from one of our MPs, Jim Shannon, and he said this, and I think we can apply this to all the areas that we've been talking about. These are issues of a personal nature, matters of morality, and it's best left for parents to decide how to raise their children. It's not for the state to decide the morality and standards of each family in the United Kingdom. It's for those families and parents to decide, and it should not be otherwise. Someone might not agree with how I bring up my children, and I might not agree with how they bring up theirs. But fundamental to the values of a democratic society is our respect of the privacy of each other's family life at home and our upholding of the freedom of conscience, thought, and religion. I think we could go along with that in relation to all the things that we've talked about. Now, of course, if the duty of the state, the duty of the law is to protect. And where there are cases where children, young people, families are at risk, where perhaps they're being taught material which isn't good for them, there has to be an involvement in that. Question? To protect our children. But what is that involvement? How do we balance the involvement between state and family?